I spent years opening dozens of bank accounts for myself and my companies all around the world, and I just went through and closed so many bank accounts. Today I'm going to tell you which ones and why. So why am I closing so many bank accounts when I tell you that you should have offshore banking options all over the world? Quite simply, as guinea pig number one for Nomad Capitalist, I opened more bank accounts than I ever needed because I wanted to test out the experience, on top of the fact that over the years, certain banks just aren't as convenient, or I got too many banks in one place and they just become duplicative, or online banking goes to the dogs, or something changes. And what I think is worthwhile is to constantly review the options that you have in your life. This is what Nomad Capitalist really is all about. Ask yourself, what passport or passports do I have, and is it serving me? And what's changed in the last 5 years? I think if we ask ourselves that question more often about everything, that's how you go where you're treated best. So, I'm a believer in having almost too much diversification at first, having a lot of options, seeing how it all works, and then pulling it back once you establish that. And so it is more work to set up in the first place. Obviously, we help our clients open bank accounts all around the world, and there are transactional bank accounts. There are accounts that are more for cold storage for your wealth. There are accounts that are more focused on investing, and you want to have perhaps some of all of those. But for me, most people have too few options. Bill Ackman talked recently about, a lot of companies keep hundreds of millions of dollars in one bank account in one country. I say go wide and then pull it back. And if you come to our annual event, Nomad Capitalist Live, you're going to hear about hundreds of different ways to diversify. If you're our client, we help you find the best options. This is something that I'm really passionate about. But what I'm going to tell you today is the bank accounts specifically that I closed. These banks aren't necessarily bad. I'm not saying that you shouldn't bank there or that anyone shouldn't bank there, but they no longer worked for me. I'm going to go through the list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different banks that I closed or I'm in the process of closing right now, plus one that I thought I might close and ultimately chose not to. Now, the first is TD Canada. So Americans have TD Bank. Canadians have TD Canada Trust. I opened this account about 10 years ago. It was a dual Canadian dollar, US dollar account. By the time I had closed it, all the money was in Canadian dollars. There was a time when I was building up some liquidity for a number of reasons, moved a bunch of money into Canadian dollars during the pandemic when the Canadian dollar was lower, and just wanted to park some money there. Have other places to put the liquidity now. It had just been sitting there for a while, realized I couldn't even log into the account, and so I call them up and I say, hey, how do I get access to my account? And they did something. This is only in the United States have I really heard this so forcefully. Oh, you just step into a branch and we'll take care of that for you. And they said, I don't want to go to Canada. I'm not going to go through the rigmarole to be able to go to Canada. So that's the only option. Yes, that's the only option. I said, well, what can I do? And I had to push them a little while. And finally they said, we can send you a draft, what an American would call a check, and we'll send that to your address. And I said, okay, you have an address in the US. And they said, okay, we'll send a draft to that address. They closed the account and they sent this Canadian dollar draft. And so I got that. And then I FedExed that to one of my other bankers, and he had already agreed before I had closed the account. Yes, we can take your Canada draft and we can, process that. It'll take a couple weeks. I think there was like a $500 draft fee. Eventually the money is in my account. TD Canada no more. Now, what I asked them before I closed it is, hey, if I ever wanted to come to Canada, can I just open an account? They said, yeah, I said, I'm not an American anymore. They said, yeah, we don't care if you're in Canada, step on in. We'd be happy to open you an account. And my experience was that that's a bank where they're more flexible for opening accounts. Obviously, Canada and Canada's banks had some turmoil in the last couple of years, and people had their accounts frozen. This is one of the things I talk about, by the way, where we actually did talk about some of the problems in Canada, but I'm not Canadian. I'm not there. This is not an account that I ever transacted with. I don't think I ever used the debit card. I just parked some money there. The average person who doesn't talk about stuff on YouTube would have even less of a risk. If you're not politically active in Canada, it's less of a risk than if you are in Canada, if you live there, if you're politically active. So I never had as much of a concern, but somewhat in solidarity and just largely due to the inconvenience, I just said, give me that money. I have investments to put it into, and that's gone. Another bank I closed is one I actually have told you about for a long, long time, and I still like the bank. I kind of like the bank stock. That's not my investment advice to you. I just kind of like the stock as well. That's TBC Bank in Georgia. I've been an advocate of Georgia for a while. Lika the lawyer is coming to Nomad Capitalist Live. She'll be talking to you about how you can open a bank account in Georgia, potentially without even going there. I've actually seen a couple times when people who were doing business in Georgia actually had their TBC bank accounts closed down for seemingly no reason. I do think Bank of Georgia has become a bit more innovative now in terms of opening accounts with their solo program. They're rolling out American Express cards, and for the first time I'm hearing my team members like, I'm getting an American Express and I get a lounge card, and it's kind of like not US levels, but they're starting to roll out some of those benefits at a lower level than what you'd get in the US at Bank of Georgia. TBC is the largest bank in Georgia, and it's fine, but just like the online banking seems to never work. For me, not living there, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I'm probably just getting a little bit old. But that combined with just some of the frustrations, combined with the fact that honestly, how many people have opened accounts at TBC Bank over the years? And I just feel like, the management to me was always like, whatever. It's like, okay. So Bank of Georgia is a good bank in Georgia. There's other smaller banks in Georgia that potentially you could work with. I found TBC not to be a bad bank, just to be duplicative. And I said, let's just merge it together. For me, with interest rates now being higher, what you're seeing is developed world banks, Singapore, the UAE, even the US, they're paying higher interest rates. You used to go to Georgia, Armenia, places like that to get higher interest rates on your US dollars back when it was a pittance in those developed markets. Now, everybody's paying you close to 5%, and Georgia's not. You can still make a lot of money on the lottery, but you're at 1.5%, 2% in US dollars. And so when you look at the risk, I'm not worried about Georgian banks, but statistically speaking, they're not at the level of Singaporean banks. If I'm going to keep cash, why would I keep it at a much lower rate than I would in Singapore? And so that made me say, okay, I do have a lottery position. There's other things that I can do with the Georgian bank. Let me consolidate the two together. And TBC was the one that went. I had previously closed a bank account I had at Terra Bank, which is the Emirati-owned bank, which they actually have like a 24-hour branch in the casino. And that was just kind of too provincial, I felt. Only TBC and Bank of Georgia kind of understand international transactions at a high level. Also in Singapore, I'm closing UOB. It's the smallest of the big three, I think, in Singapore. I opened this account right before the pandemic. And then the priority banker that I had left. And then I tried to send my signature probably 6 different times through the mail to confirm getting the online banking set up, because I didn't do it when I was there. I was only there for a day, something like that. Rule number 1, spend 2 days opening a bank account, even if it only takes 1. And they just wouldn't do it. And then the person left. It was just, for 3 years, I had nobody to help me. And I kind of went in last year, and they convinced me to keep it open. The guy was a nice guy. He's like, oh yeah, I can see you. How could you not have a person in charge of your account for all that time? I said, yeah. And then I just had more problems. I said, I've had enough. Just close it. And it was a bit of a pain, quite frankly. I like other banks in Singapore. I've talked about the Singaporean bank stocks being interesting, tax-free dividend plays for some people. I just don't have the same warm and fuzzy feeling about UOB. It becomes duplicative. One of the things we're talking about at Nomad Capitalist Live this year is we've got our Malaysian banker coming. And there's ways, if you open accounts in Malaysia, if you open accounts in Thailand by virtue of being a resident there, or even sometimes not being a resident, that's often a conduit, people to get bank accounts in Singapore. And so I think I'm well enough covered in Singapore that UOB was duplicative. It was the most annoying of the banks that I've had. I have friends who say, yeah, the service is terrible. I think it's a very strong bank. Statistically, it's in the top 15 in the world. I'm not worried about that, which is probably why I let it sit open for so long. But I just said, why do I need so many accounts? Let's consolidate this. And so out went UOB. In Armenia, I had a couple of accounts. Erste Bank, out. This was not a very tech-friendly bank, and so it was always kind of annoying. I had a power of attorney there, which is one thing if you have smaller accounts in places, what I call tunnels. We have a team in Armenia. We have a good lawyer in Armenia that we work with, and so they had power of attorney to manage the account. Everything had to be managed in person. This was back when they were paying really, really high interest rates. I said, I just put some money there. I'll call it a tunnel. I'll make a nice return. Ultimately, it just wasn't that interesting anymore. 4% on your US dollars, just some small amount. It's just, after all these years, that amount means nothing, and it's just too much hassle. And I get their emails. Just get the mental clutter out. But hey, it's an option that worked for me. I closed it down. I think that they're, what I'm told, is one of the stronger banks there, one of the larger banks. Ultimately, for a lesser amount of money, I said, move it all into one bank. I've done very well in the Armenian dram. Bought a bunch of Armenian dram around 500 to 520. It's now about 400 since the war. So an unfortunate reason to earn about 25% appreciation on your currency. They pay you 10 or 11% a year. In the other Armenian bank, you only need one, you don't need two. I think that what happens is if you start doing this and as you become more successful, I've seen clients like, all right, put 10 grand in that bank in Georgia, for example. And then they have a big year. They're like, all right, 50 grand's now my minimum to hassle with it. And so you kind of increase the amounts over time. What I also do is, Armenian banks have okay deposit insurance. I think the banks there are decent. And I'm willing to go above the insured limit. I don't see a huge risk of default there. Unlike U.S. banks, didn't just another one fail. And so there's a certain amount for me where it's now like, all right, it's not worth screwing with it for less than that. So put two of them together, maybe, jack one up a little bit and just focus on one bank. So anyway, Erste Bank is out. In Montenegro, same story. I have a home in Montenegro. I have opened accounts there going back to 2014. So Prva Bank. One thing you want to consider if you're closing an account is, could I get a residence permit? So if I own property in Montenegro, I can go and get a residence permit. I'm not convinced I could keep that residence permit long term because they generally want you to live there now to keep the residence permit. But I could get a residence permit for a year. And with that residence permit, I could go and open a bank account. I had previously closed Erste Bank, where they really only want people at Erste Bank who live in Montenegro all the time. And they couldn't reach me, and they're like, hey, we're going in this direction. What do you want to do? And I'm like, all right, let's be done. So I had already closed that. Prva Bank, I'm sure if I wanted to go back and get the account with a residence card, I could do that. I don't need a residence card to go to Montenegro because I can go as a tourist for 90 days. And that's a residence permit I chose not to have anymore because it wasn't worth the hassle of maintaining it and spending a couple days in the ground every year to go to police offices and what have you. But Prva Bank in Montenegro, gone for the reason of, you go to a country, you get a residence card, you test at a couple of banks. This again, much like Erste Bank, not the most technologically advanced bank. None of the banks in Montenegro are really that zippy for online banking. The whole kind of Balkan region, I would say, is not that great. Sadifa lives in North Macedonia, just visited us recently. And she was telling us, it's not as advanced. I'm not sure I can do that. And we had people comparing like Georgian bank versus North Macedonian bank. And it was, Georgia comes out much, much higher. So the Balkans is not as online friendly. Even Serbia is not so good. Actually, UniCredit in Serbia was closed. I closed that last year. So that's an extra one. Again, bad online presence. You go to some branch, it's like the Yugoslavia times. Out you go. Sometimes you have too much diversification, just like keeping these little tunnels. Have enough tunnels, maybe you set up too many, and then you kind of pull it back again. The last bank account I closed, and I won't mention which bank, but it was a bank in the Bahamas. There's talk about different banks in the Bahamas and what exposure they have to an FTX scenario. When that whole thing exploded, I had gotten an email from them saying, hey, we don't have any exposure to that. But ultimately just decided, in part because someone that I had worked with had left, and they had some questions, I said, I'm going to close this account. What you get with the Bahamas, is with many of those kind of island offshore banking jurisdictions, is you pay higher fees for everything. Now, what's also interesting about those jurisdictions is they don't really keep the money there. So if you want to place, let's say, a term deposit, they'll say, hey, we have these accounts at 8 different banks around the world. Which one do you want? And they each pay different rates, and they each have obviously different, credit ratings, what have you. But big banks, BNP Paribas, or Qatar National Bank, QNB, things like that. But they're going to then take a slice of your interest. They're going to charge you thousands of dollars in fees a year. They're going to charge you $100 to send a wire. Whereas some banks that I work with, you keep a little bit of money in there, they charge you $0 to send a wire. And ultimately, I just said to myself, I don't know that the experience here is good enough. The unique niche that they target at that bank doesn't particularly benefit me. And I just said, it's not worth it for me to keep that level of money. I will move it out. I will close the account. So that's 7 banks that I've closed, 6 recently and 1 last year. I looked at closing my UAE bank, and I have a great respect for what the UAE's done. They've done an incredible job building a country that's very responsive. I don't like the new 9% tax. I don't think it's everything it's cracked up to be. And quite frankly, I don't like how you run UAE companies. I don't have an active UAE company at this point. I also don't love the personal banking there. I just think that even at the private banking level, I have not been impressed, honestly. Now, I chose to keep it. I'd send some money. It's in dirhams. All right, why not have it? I think that those banks are quite safe, but I'm not going to use it as a transactional bank account. Just even the ability of people to communicate in English. It's subpar to Singapore. It's subpar to Malaysia, quite frankly. It's perhaps on a level with Georgia in terms of what you get. But to get that same level of service in Georgia, they want $20,000 or even less to be deposited. In the UAE, they want a lot more than that, quite frankly. I'm a big fan of banks in Asia. I think that's where the transactional low-fee banking is. I'm a fan of tunnels all around the world, but those are some accounts that I closed and why. Now, if you're an American, I do think some of these banks would open accounts for you. But if you have a bunch of different account numbers and money coming in and out of different accounts, that's going to be a pain. So cleaning things up is a good thing. I think if you're an American, you have just as much of a need to diversify as everybody else, but be aware that the faster you do this cleanup, the easier your reporting will be. One thing we connect our clients with are good, truly international tax professionals who file all the paperwork for you to make sure you do it properly, because most tax professionals that I've seen don't know how to properly report bank accounts. So that's my suggestion, is get a lot of options, see what feels comfortable. It's quite possible that if you set up 3 bank accounts, one transactional, one more for wealth storage, and one that allows you to do some investing, all 3 won't work out. I've told you about accounts I've closed in the past in places like Liechtenstein. The service was terrible. The fees are high. It's not worth it. I mean, if you work with us, we're going to tell you, here's the experience. But hey, depending on how much you want to deposit, you may not have as many options. And the first one you choose, you may not feel it. You may not like it for some reason. So have a few more options and be able to move around. So if you work with Nomad Capitalist, you get options with banks. And by the way, we've spent the last 6 months with me leading, doing a ton of research on banks, coordinating all the information that every single person had, where there's certain people. We got one guy, this guy is just in love with calling banks and building relationships with banks. So we've got about 900 banks at this point that we've just gone through and freshened up. Some portion of those 900 banks could work for you, could work for the business that you set up overseas. And so if you work with Nomad Capitalist, we help you with personal banking, business banking. Where's your company incorporated? Where do you live? How does that work with your taxes? How do you reduce your taxes? Do you need a second passport? It's all under one roof, and it's powered by us doing a lot of this hands-on research and learning what actually works. I see people in Hong Kong still recommending set up your company and we'll get you an account at HSBC. I said, is it 2013? Is that still working? No bank will work 100% of the time. Sometimes we have to make changes because banks just get squirrely on us. But we're not going to tell you something that stopped working a decade ago. And that's the benefit of working with Nomad Capitalist. You can go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply and learn how to become our client. And it's all backed by me and a handful of other people here who just love talking to banks. That's what you get.